want to apologize in advance if the roar is still on the camera. I could take my hat off for this. I'm waiting to get a replacement camera, but sometimes it's off. Anyway, all right. The newlyweds, Peter and Heidi, they set off in their overalls and flannel shirts and SKs. They set off on a walk to explore the town of Erstrink. And they started out, having left the off and on tour guide's little office building behind, they headed off, in that beautiful little train station was on their left, restored, beautiful thing. And the train was too, and the street was level. It was virtually level. And they noticed, of course, now down below they could see all the way down to the Erstring Park, but they were studying the houses. Peter especially, but both of them. They were studying these houses because they were from an era that actually Peter knew some of this stuff, because when he was in college he had studied a bunch of little things and dabbling in thinking about what do you call it, structural engineering. He'd studied the history of domestic architecture, homes, some. And he recognized this. This was the Victorian style. These houses must have been built 1890s, 1900s, somewhere around there, he was guessing. And it kind of fit with the Gothic revival that he saw in the castle. People nicknamed the castle that, where it said Leatherworks at the top. Well, he looked at them, and they were all slightly different, but they all had a similar style. And they were gradually, he could say, well, they were already pretty fixed up. From what he gathered, the town had sort of been in decline, but then with the Great Awakening and change, it had started this incredible burst. And so they were fixed up, and they were pretty nice. And they got to the end of that row, and they saw that the street was called Hospital Street, and Avenue, actually, Hospital Avenue. And they were puzzled because there was no hospital anywhere in sight, and then the streets seemed to end there. And then the street that they came, when they met, when they see that the train track climbs a little bit, and where that Hospital Avenue met a street going up onto Ridgeback. Now that's where they had been on that before. That street they saw was called Spa Street, S-P-A, Spa Street, Hospital Spa. They were puzzled a little bit, but then they noticed that there was a gymnasium right there, a gym, and they figured they'd have to ask about it later. And the gym was kind of new looking, and they wondered. Well, I'll tell you now what they found out later. They found out that there had been a dramatically beautiful hospital right there where that gym is now, and it had been a spa. Well, it had been various things. It had been a hotel. It had been a sort of a spa for people to go there in the summer to be near the Erstrink, and it had been a nursing school. It wasn't very big, and then for quite a while it had been a hospital, the hospital of the town, which had moved later. So all right, that explained Hospital Ave and Spa Street. It had been a spa. Well, then they crossed the railroad track, and they decided to go up into the area which Beatrice had called Overspring. And they found themselves walking up an avenue called Hemlock Avenue. And they were tempted to go back into the alleys right away to follow her advice, but they didn't. They stayed, and now the train track was down on their right, and they were climbing, so it was a little bit lower, and they could see the train. They figured it would be really fun to see that train go by. especially with the steam engine. Uh, so they went up, and now Peter was beginning to figure out some stuff about these houses. He hadn't studied intensely at the time, but so many of these houses, virtually all of them, were two-story. And they all seemed to have chimneys right in the center of them, because you could see the chimneys still coming up, and still in use, no doubt, even though they were so old. Of course, they would have been coal back at that time. And he thought to himself, boy, that's an efficient way to have your heating system with your chimney right in the center of the house. And it was predictable. I mean, house after house, it was the same way. Peter also suspected that those houses might have been built from a sort of a pattern book from back at that time, because so many of them seemed to have the same style, and he liked it. Well, they went up, and then they came to a street called, what was that street? Butternut Street. And he said, oh, that's a tree. Hemlock's a tree. These streets must be named after trees. So they turned left. They could have gone on, but it didn't look like it was going to have a way out. So they turned left onto Butternut Street. Now, I'm going to forget all these streets. And they continued up, and sure enough, still, those same houses, they weren't identical. They were all different. They were variations on a theme, you might say. But they predominantly had chimneys right in the middle, and many were brick. Most looked to be frame houses. And another thing Peter noticed as he was going along, they were holding hands. I mean, but anyway, he noticed that there were almost no cracks in any of the foundations, or the brick houses, for example. Even though they were very old houses, they didn't have cracks in the masonry. And he thought to himself, boy, these must have been really well built. He also thought to himself, I'll bet these are rough sawn. I'll bet those 2x4s inside those houses are full 2x4s, unlike modern houses where a 2x4 is what, a 1.5 by 3.5, and that spruce or fir that comes out from Canada, it's like fluff. These were probably, he wondered, could they be oak? And he thought, no, I doubt if they were oak. They're probably pine, but it's probably thick, unfinished pine. He's a little like his father, a lot like his father. In some ways, he was following Jenny's footsteps in going into engineering. And they walked along, admiring this. And then what they come to? Well, I can't remember all these street names, but there was Elm Street. And by now he noticed, hey, all these streets are being named after trees. That's cool. That's cool. There was an Oak Street, and they took their time, and eventually they started to take a chance and go into the alleys to follow Beatrice's advice. And going down the alleys, now it was so different. And that's where the people were mostly. Now this was what, Monday? And a lot of people were off at work. But those that were at home, you could see them puttering around in their alleys. And the other thing that they had noticed, and they both commented on this almost right away, was the gardens. The gardens. Out front, the houses were kind of close to the streets, and so they'd have gardens. These people seemed to love their flowers and bushes, and when you got back in the alleys, it was even more so. That there were people they'd have just a little bit of property, but they'd keep it really nice and trimmed up, and wherever they could, they'd have a garden. Another thing he noticed about the houses, or they noticed about the houses, was a lot of them, even though they were old, and some of them even still needing to be restored, had stained glass windows in the doors, and oval windows in the front doors, and fancy well, like like you'd expect of a Victorian house. Although there are some unbelievably rich Victorian houses. There was one probably in Drink that they'd eventually find. It was sort of like that, but they all had, and dormers, dormers up there in all kinds of variations. He was fascinated, but it was the gardens that really got their attention. Now, as they headed up a little bit further, they noticed that the houses were getting smaller now. They were one story, a lot of them. And I don't know my domestic architecture well enough to say, but bungalows, maybe they might have been called, even ranch houses. It was real clear that that was a newer part of the town as the town had grown out. These houses must have been built maybe in the 1950s or so, maybe even 1960s. Well, people greeted them as they walked by. You know, here's a couple, no traffic. They could walk right in the middle of the street. They didn't. They stayed on the sidewalks, but no traffic. And every time they went by somebody, the people would speak to them and they'd speak to them. And more than once, they were invited to stop and have some tea or whatever. And they were tempted, but they declined. But they friendly waves all around. And I think the people of Earth's Drink had already begun. Word had already begun to get around that there was a newlywed couple in town spending their honeymoon, and these people fit what they expected right away. So they continued, and then it kind of went around, and they were still following Beatrice's advice, and they crossed East Street, where it goes out of town on toward Fishersburg, I think is the town, and out there toward the airport too. But they didn't go out that way very far. They stayed in closer and were making a real big circle. And then once they got across East Street, the names of the streets changed dramatically, and they were interested in that. And I'll go on with their walk. I hate to call it a hike because it was just so leisurely, just hand in hand, walking along, talking, enjoying the day. I'll tell you about that in the next video. Bye for now.